Islam in historical context. This is normal in, say, the study of the New Testament in Christianity. You wouldn't like ignore the fact that it grew up some years after Palestine had been incorporated into the Roman Empire. There are big books by John Dominic Crossan and others about Jesus as a Roman peasant and so forth. But setting the early Islam in context is rare. There are a few classicists like Glenn Bowersock at Princeton who've begun doing some of this. This is, in my own view, in part because the context for the rise of Islam was the Roman Empire. It was the late Roman Empire, after Christianity had become the state religion, after it had moved its capital from Rome to Constantinople, so that business was largely conducted in Greek and not in Latin. And it was a period of the Roman Empire after 312 when Constantine converted to Christianity, which was less studied. So there are huge numbers of books about the Roman Republic, but the number of books about the 500s of the Roman Empire is very tiny. Actually, I was able to get through most of them. It was an advantage in my case. But I think one of the reasons that Islam has very seldom been set strongly in this context is because of Orientalism. It's because Orientalism operates by a self-other dichotomy. So for European and American scholars of Jewish and Christian heritage, Islam is the other. And admitting that Islam is a Roman religion obliterates the self-other divide in ways that I think are uncomfortable for people. There was a great historian of early Islam who wrote 20 years ago, not so long ago, that he thought that one verse of the Quran implied that Islam should be imposed on people according to the Quran, and that he had difficulty with this verse as someone belonging to the Western tradition. And I thought to myself, this person has no idea what the policies of the Roman Empire were, because in the Christian Roman Empire, it was not allowed to be anything other than Christian or Jewish with regard to public practice. And public polytheism, there was a death sentence on that. And then people were forcibly converted. In 634, after the death of the prophet, the Emperor Heraclius of the Roman Empire actually made a decree that all Jews had to convert to Christianity immediately, and all synagogues would be turned into churches. So, whereas I read the Quran to give a place in society to Jews and Zoroastrians and non-Muslims, and even to pagans, as long as they're not violent pagans. And the scholar's conception, and this is somebody whose specialty is early Islam, the scholar's conception was exactly the opposite of the reality as I saw the reality. But I think it's partly because this particular person hadn't studied a lot about the 500s in the Roman Empire. So didn't have a broader civilizational context in which to put Islam. And I have to say that is also partly the fault of the Muslim tradition about early Islam. And I think, most of the books we have about the Prophet Muhammad and early Islam were written 150, 200, 300 years after the Prophet in Baghdad, in the Abbasid Empire. There was a tendency, there was a kind of an internal Orientalism there. There was a tendency to see early Islam's context as only that of Inner Arabia. And so they, because they were at war with the Byzantines, the successors to the Roman Empire, I think also had difficulty in breaking down the self-other divide and imagining that the Prophet Muhammad might have, for instance, looked favorably upon the Roman Empire. And my book was just reviewed at Al Jazeera in Arabic, and the one thing that they couldn't take was this idea that early Islam was in some ways allied with or thought well of the Roman Empire. I think the Quran is very explicit about this, because at the time, the Prophet lived in Mecca, there in the bottom right corner, and not very far from Roman domain to the north. And then the Iranians also were just to the east in what is now Iraq and Mesopotamia, and also they had Yemen. So the Prophet was living in a place in between these two great empires, and all of the sources, including the Muslim and the Christian ones, the earliest ones we have, say that he was a long-distance merchant who went up to Basra in southern Syria and to Damascus and to Gaza for trade. So that clearly was his part of his context. And I think there's also evidence that he went down to Yemen for trade. And when you read the accounts written in the Abbasid Empire, they don't really play up his travels. They don't see him as a cosmopolitan person. And all of the anecdotes in these later sources, the Arabic sources, are set in Mecca and Medina. So they have a very sort of circumscribed view of things. We're now beginning to get much more in the way of context for what came before Islam and what it was a reform of. And so something like 5,000 Arabic rock inscriptions have now been recorded that were made in the period from the time of Christ till about 400 of the Common Era. In other words, the centuries just before the rise of Islam in the early 600s. Arabic is an old language, but we don't have very much written in it until the rise of Islam. But now we do have these rock inscriptions. The earlier ones are actually often in Aramaic or in a form of Aramaic inflected by Arabic. You know, Aramaic was the spoken language in Palestine and Syria, and was the language Jesus spoke, for instance. But in the Hejaz and in what is now Saudi Arabia, Arabic and various dialects of Arabic were predominant. And these rock inscriptions are being deciphered. They're in a special script or a set of scripts. And it's becoming increasingly clear that they do carry some cultural information. So one of them I brought for this purpose, just to set the context of the idea of peace, is a pagan inscription from before Islam. And it is by a woman, incidentally. And it seems to be that some of these inscriptions were actually written by women. So there were literate Arabic-speaking women. And the woman, Shamat, has a mule, and she's asking for blessings on her animal and on her prosperity, because the mule, you know, is used for various tasks of a rural nature. And so she asks the goddesses, Shahqam and Alat, to bless this mule, and asks that these goddesses bestow peace, salam, on her. It's an interesting document. I think feminists could do something with it, because it's an inscription about a woman who's a property owner and who's praying to two goddesses for peace. But the word peace that's being used here, salam, in Old Arabic, didn't just mean peace in the sense of a lack of conflict or a lack of war, of harmony. It also means well-being and prosperity, which I think is very interesting if you take the word peace and explore its possible meanings. Galtung, the theorist of peace studies, says that there are two kinds of peace. There's negative peace and positive peace. So negative peace is what we usually think of lack of warfare, lack of conflict. And the Lord knows that's good. But Galtung thinks that you also have to attend to positive peace, which is implementing social policies that make for harmony. So if you have a lot of economic injustice, in Galtung's view, you're lacking in positive peace. And I think the Arabic salam is interesting in the sense that, as we know it from these inscriptions and from the Quran and early Arabic literature, it has within it both the idea of positive peace and negative peace. It precedes Galtung in these emphases. Arabia at the time of the 500s, say, is characterized by a mix of oases and marginal land. Marginal land in the sense that you can't do rainfall agriculture. And people in North America, in my view, might have a little bit of difficulty understanding what it's like to live in a place where you cannot do. It's not just a matter, do you have one season or 2 seasons? You cannot do rainfall agriculture. There is not enough rain. It's an arid zone. It doesn't mean that the land is worthless or that it has no fauna, that it has no plant life in it. It has a great variety, and there's various kinds of arid areas. There's savanna, and people think about the desert as that yellow dune desert that they show you in the Hollywood films. I've always thought that the Hollywood films are making an error there, because in that kind of desert nobody lives. That's just completely arid, like the empty quarter of Saudi Arabia, which is named the empty quarter for a reason. But then there's other kinds of desert that has plant life. And typically, from time to time, here and there's a little bit of rain, especially this time of year. And the plant life is adapted so that when it gets a little bit of rain, it flourishes, it turns green, it blooms, and so forth. And if you raise sheep and goats, camel, and you're willing to take them around to wherever the pasturage pops up, then you can make a pretty good living as a shepherd. And that's how people lived. But what it meant is you have to give up the idea of staying in a house. You're mobile. So these are pastoral nomads. And some of them had regular routes that they went on. They were called transhumants. But others of them were more random. And they usually had stomping grounds. They had places that they tended to stay around, but they moved around. And pastoral nomads were a significant proportion of the population in Arabia at the time of the Prophet Muhammad. They weren't the majority. Most people lived in settled villages, in oases, in places like Medina, but I don't know, was a third of the people were likely pastoralists. And pastoral nomads are natural cavalry. They're always on horseback, they're shooting arrows, throwing spears, and a lot of times they engage in raiding. They're mobile. There's not usually in the places that they live a lot of government. It's hard to get a hold of them to make them obey a government decree or to make them pay taxes. You have to spend more money chasing them to get taxes out of them than probably it would be worth. And then sometimes they fight back and kill you. They were thought of by the Roman Empire as being elements of disorder. And they were thought to be anarchic. They were a despote. They were without a despot, without a ruler in the terminology of the time. But you can't live your life under those circumstances all the time. Nothing would get done. You couldn't trade and so forth. So the Arabs had developed a system of sacred months, sacred time, sacred places where fighting and raiding were not allowed. Because there were a lot of feuds going on and people were rustling each other's herds and flocks. But they wouldn't do it in certain months and they wouldn't do it in certain places. So we have an ambassador to the various Arab petty principalities of the 500s under Justinian, the great Roman emperor who made the code of Justinian on which a lot of Western law is based. And he sent an ambassador out to the Arabic-speaking people. And he left a little bit of fragment of his impressions, but one of the things he said was that the Arabs have this meeting place consecrated to one of the gods where they assemble for a month or 2 months at a time. And during these meetings, complete peace prevails, not only amongst themselves, but also with the natives and even with the animals. There were two kinds of sanctuary where the Arabs didn't engage in any kind of violence. One was a human sanctuary because of the existence of a shrine to a god, and the other was an animal sanctuary, the Hema. And Taif, for instance, which is now a very nice Saudi resort town, was an animal reserve. It was a place where you couldn't kill animals because there was a sacred stone dedicated to the goddess Alat, who was identified by Near Easterners with Athena in the Greek pantheon. And in Mecca, from what we know from the early Arabic sources, it was both a human sanctuary and an animal sanctuary. It was both a haram and a hema. So you couldn't fight, you couldn't conduct a feud in Mecca, you also couldn't go hunting in Mecca. The later Abbasid sources say you couldn't cut down trees there, but I think they were overly optimistic about the existence of trees in Mecca. So Muhammad was born in, I think, you see 570 a lot of the times. I think there's reason to think it was 567. But in any case, according to the earliest sources we have on the Muslim side, and there's some indication of this in the Quran, he was born into a city called Mecca, which was a haram. It was a shrine to God. And the Arabs of the time, some of them had converted to Christianity, some were Jews, but it seems that a lot of them were still following the old pagan religion, like the inscription that they were worshiping the goddess Alat, that those things survived down there. In the Eastern Roman Empire, in Damascus and Jerusalem and so forth, the weight of imperial policy had probably wiped out paganism by then. But you get outside the city into villages, and there still seem to have been pagans, and then among pastoral nomads and tribespeople. But the Arab pantheon included a chief god, Allah, the one God, the highest God, and so there seems to have been, as far as I can tell, by the 500s, a kind of dispute among the Arabs that was that just one God and the other gods are really just kind of angels or envoys of the one God, or is he like Zeus, that he has brothers and sisters and daughters and sons, and Zeus was very busy. And actually, Allah, the Arab one God, was often identified in bilingual inscriptions with Greek as Zeus. In any case, the shrine at Mecca appears to have been to Allah. The later Muslim sources get this wrong because they say that it was dedicated to a minor Arab god named Hubal. There are like 4 inscriptions to Hubal that have been found, but he's obviously not very important because there's not very many inscriptions. And 2 of them were found in Italy they were Arab traders who were out there. So it's very unlikely, and the likelihood is, from everything we can tell, that the shrine in Mecca was to Theos, or to Allah, to the God. This is recognized in the Quran because it says, by the fig and the olive in Mount Sinai, and this sanctuary city, Hadal Balad al-Amin. And I think nowadays Muslims often say this verse without realizing what it means. It means that Mecca is a haram. It's a place where you can't fight. The Prophet's clan, Banu Hashim, were in charge of enforcing the rules of sanctuary. So they were the ones who mediated disputes and tried to keep people from conducting feuds in the city, because it was also, they had trade fairs there, and it would interfere with commerce. And it was also just felt wrong to have a feud going on in the sanctuary city. So I'm making an argument that I'm not aware has been made before, and it's always daunting when you make an argument that nobody has made in 1400 years. But I'm saying Muhammad was, by his family inheritance and by his geography, by his clan, was a peacemaker. That's how he started out. He was a long-distance merchant. Being a long-distance merchant depended on these holy months and on the sanctuaries, which were declared off-limits to feuding. And so there's evidence that Muhammad's uncle, Abu Talib, when there was a murder in Mecca at one point, he had to intervene, and he went to the suspect and said, you know, either you have to pay blood money, you have to pay over 100 camels, or your clan has to all sign an affidavit that you didn't do it, or we'll have to execute you. But this story may or may not be true. It exists in the early Muslim sources, but I think underlying it is certainly a truth, which is the Banu Hashim were the peacemakers, were the mediators. Now, when the Prophet was about 35, in my reckoning, a war broke out between the Eastern Roman Empire and the Sasanian Empire in Iran. It was a brutal war, and it was a long war. It was 2.5 decades. It involved what is now Syria, Egypt, the Balkans, Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, modern-day Azerbaijan, Iran, and Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq. It depleted over these 2.5 decades the two empires. It left them exhausted. It is said towards the end that the Romans had no cavalry left. They just had infantry. And it was fought all around the Prophet, because the Iranians were in Yemen and in what is now Iraq. The Romans were allied with Ethiopia across the Red Sea. And then the Iranians invaded into Syria and what is now Jordan and Israel-Palestine, and they actually went all the way to Egypt and probably a bit into what is now Libya. And so when the Quran is talking about things, I always try to keep in mind what's going on in its world, and it is reacting in many times, I think, against these wars. Peace in the Quran, the word salam or sulah, the various words for kinds of peace and conciliation, peacemaking, etc., are a big theme in this book. This is why it's a little bit amazing to me. I might have missed something, but I'm not aware there's ever been a book written about the idea of peace in the Quran until mine. Like a whole concentrated study. Even in Arabic and Muslim languages, there are kind of maybe some pamphlets and so forth, but an academic study, I couldn't find one. But it's a big subject in the book, and it's a big subject for Muslim theology and for ethics. So when you do, nowadays you can do these database searches in the Quran of the words. The first big cluster of occurrences of the word peace that I found were in early chapters of the Quran, we think chronologically early, which were about heaven. And nowadays we all know those apocryphal stories about 72 virgins and martyrdom and so forth. But in the Quran there's nothing like that. In the Quran, the highest level of heaven is when God addresses you and says, peace, that's a blessing you would like to have. When the voice of God comes to you and says peace, the Quran says that's the ultimate level of heaven. And then if you're good enough to get into heaven, when you get there, the angels greet you with peace. And then people in heaven are always saying peace to one another. Peace, the Quran's heaven is not dedicated to martial activities. It's a place of communing in peace. And I think it's put forward as a model for how life is to be lived on earth. Often it's the case in religions when they tell you about heaven, they're not telling you about an other place. They're telling you about the ideal for human life. There's also a verse in the Quran which identifies God as peace. Among other things, he's the king, the holy, the peace, the defender, the guardian, the mighty, the omnipotent, the supreme. And if you think about this sort of line of attributes of God that's mentioned in the Quran, they're about protection, they're about well-being, they're about order, so all of the things that we associate with peace, but peace is one of the names of God. I mentioned that the pre-Islamic Arabs believed in those goddesses. And at some point, the Muslim sources in the Quran indicate that the Prophet began not sort of preaching against the goddesses so much as just sort of letting people know that they didn't exist. In fact, the Quran contains this very interesting instruction to the believers in the Prophet's mission that they're not supposed to talk dirty about the goddesses. Because the Quran says what would happen, what's natural is they'll be offended, and then they'll talk dirty about God. And then the Quran says, well, you know, God has made every people that they take pride in their own culture. So the Quran understands about them being pagans and being proud of being pagans. They're just wrong. So don't be mean to them about it. Don't curse their goddesses. But they don't exist. And it's an interesting thing because in Christianity of this time, and Zoroastrianism as well in Iran, people typically felt that the old gods existed, but were demons. So people who worshipped them were possessed by demons or were ritually impure, ritually unclean. And there was a certain amount of vigilante violence. There were lynchings and so forth by Christians against the remaining pagans. And in Egypt, the temple to Serapis was actually was a huge temple. A mob just came and tore it all down. And the pagan woman philosopher, Hypatia, was tortured to death and killed by committed Christians of the late 300s. The Quran is actually, it's interesting, it has a different attitude, which is these people are not evil, they're doing something that's wrong, but they're just committing a category error because they're believing in goddesses who don't actually exist. They're just names, it says the Quran, that their ancestors have come up with. And so the local people in Mecca, according to the Muslim sources, and it's in the Quran clear as well, that they didn't deal well with this criticism that their goddesses didn't exist and that they were wasting their time and doing something actually that's quite shameful in abandoning the worship of the one God for these non-existent deities. And so the sources maintain that there was a certain amount of harassment, taunting, and so forth against the early community around the Prophet. In my view, that would not have been violent because Mecca was a sanctuary. And some of the later sources began talking about clashes, or, you know, that the pagans want to come and beat up the Muslims, or the Muslim beat up a pagan. Or I think those stories are not true, because it's not what would go on in Mecca, and there's nothing in the Quran about it. One of the earliest modern academics who studied the early Islam, Prince Caetani of Italy, made this point in 1905. He said, although the chronicles talk about clashes between the early Muslims and the pagans in Mecca, the Quran doesn't say anything like that. It does say that there's harassment, that there's taunting and there's insults, and you know, there may have been like economic boycott and things like that. But because Mecca was a sanctuary, they couldn't fight there. And of course, the Muslims would not have wanted to. It wasn't their ethos. So it is said that one of the pagans intervened with the prophet and said, no, can't we compromise in some way? I'm not sure this pagan understood monotheism, because, you know, if you compromise your monotheism, then it's not monotheism anymore. And so the Quran remonstrates with this person and says, say, pagans, I do not worship what you worship, nor are you worshiping what I worship. And at the end, the passage says, to you your religion, and to me my religion. And I swear to God, some Orientalists in previous generations have taken this to be a militant statement. It's not. It's a statement that we have a theological difference here, but socially, can't we all just get along? Then the Quran says, talking about this kind of taunting, harassment, boycott, and so forth, how to deal with it. It says, be patient with what they say and take your leave of them graciously. Leave the affluent to impugn you to me, giving them a respite. And the Quran kind of gives this impression that some of the people who bothered the early believers were very wealthy, and the prophet was criticizing them for not taking care of the poor and so forth. They minded. But this word that's used here, usbur, be patient, is also the word that was used in Christian theology for tolerance in Latin. And I think it means more than just patience. And then another verse about this kind of thing says, and the servants of the All-Merciful who walk humbly upon the earth, when the unruly taunt them, they reply, peace, peace be upon you. So they're turning the other cheek. This is very similar to what Jesus says, right? That you have heard it said that you should love your neighbor and hate your enemies, but I say unto you, you should love your enemies. Well, this is what it's saying here, is that, and the word unruly I'm translating here in the Arabic is literally ignorant, but in Quranic Arabic it doesn't mean ignorant, it means undisciplined. The wise people control their passions, the unruly cannot. Then another such verse is, whose discourse is more beautiful than one who summons others to God and performs good deeds and proclaims, I am a monotheist. Good and evil are not equal. Repel the latter with the greater good, and behold, your enemy will become a devoted patron. Sounds very much like the Sermon on the Mount to me. It's saying, repel evil with good. Do good to those who are doing evil to you. And moreover, it's saying that if you do that, it can happen that your deadly enemy becomes a devoted patron, as somebody who helps you and does benefaction towards you. Similarly, it says, these shall be given their wage twice over, because they patiently endured and avert evil with good, and expend of what we have provided them. And if they hear abusive speech, they turn away from it and say, to us our deeds, and to you your deeds, peace be upon you, we do not want the rowdy. That same word, rowdy or unruly, the jahil. So this actually ties it up, that earlier passage I gave you about to you your religion and to me my religion is about wishing peace and tolerance on people with whom you theologically disagree. And then the Quran does have the lex talionis of Deuteronomy, that an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But like Jesus, it goes on to say, but God will recompense whoever pardons and makes peace. Surely he does not love wrongdoers. So you can, if somebody has committed a tort against you, you can demand blood money, you can demand that there be punishment. But the Quran says it's better if you don't. It's better if you forgive and you make peace. Aslaha in Arabic is typically translated nowadays as to reform, but sulah is very clearly peace, and it's conciliation. And so aslaha in Quranic Arabic can mean to make peace, and in this case I think it certainly does. I won't go into that right now because I'm running out of time, but I would just leave you with one more large set of thoughts that, of course, the Prophet and the early Muslim community were eventually harassed so badly and taunted so badly, and maybe the sanctuary customs of Mecca broke down because the pagans were so beside themselves with the Prophet's teaching, that the Prophet took his community and went to the nearby city of Medina. And the Meccan pagans, according to the Muslim sources and to the Quran, weren't happy about this escape. And they wanted to come after the early believers in Medina and kill them, kidnap them. There's evidence in the early sources that they considered the early religion of Islam to be kind of like a cult, so they would want to kidnap their cousin and deprogram them. At some point they started mounting military expeditions from Mecca up to Medina, which is kind of a week away riding. So the Quran makes a pivot from, I think in the Mecca surahs from 610 to 622, the Quran is more or less a pacifist document. It reflects those values of the sanctuary city. But then in the Medina period, it permits what late antique thinkers like Augustine and Ambrose would have called just war. So if the Meccan pagans are coming up with a military expedition to kill women and children and commit havoc and so forth, that it's a responsibility to defend them. And so there's no holy war in the Quran. The word that we now know, jihad, is not used that way in the Quran itself. Jihad in the Quran means ethical struggle, struggle to be good, struggle to compete with people in being good, and so forth. I don't know of any verse where you could look at it and say for sure it means to fight. The word for fighting in the Quran is secular. It's qital. It's just the word for fighting. And it says that under certain circumstances you have to fight wars of self-defense, but don't ever aggress. So only self-defense is allowed in the Quran, never aggressive war. And it says that if the enemy sues for peace, you have to give them an armistice. You would never ever say that if you were fighting an offensive war, right? Because the enemy would always sue for peace if you were attacking them, and then you'd have to stop. It's the only way that principle makes sense is that the Quran's view of this qital, or this fighting, is that it's just war in defense, and if the enemy, which is the aggressor, wants to stand down, then of course you would be willing to dicker with them. The Quran also says that if the enemy will stand down, there won't be reprisals. They'll be amnestied if they're willing to make peace for the evil things that they have done before, because they killed, companions of the Prophet and the Prophet's uncle and so forth. But the Quran promises them that if they're willing to make peace, then there will be peace and there won't be reprisals. So the later Muslim historiographies represent that the Prophet in 630 went to back to Mecca. And they represented as a kind of military expedition, so their battle standards. They do admit that there wasn't much fighting once the early believers got back into Mecca, and then they say that the Meccans acquiesced in the prophet's leadership, and the whole thing was settled. I read the Surah Al-Fatah, or the chapter of the opening, or of success in the Quran, quite differently. I read it as the Quran's account of this procession of the early believers to Mecca. And it begins by remonstrating with Bedouin allies of the Prophet. And they are saying that we're not coming with you because there's no booty involved here. And the Bedou were only willing to fight if they could, go through the pockets of the defeated soldiers for gold nuggets and things. Well, what it tells you, though, is that the Prophet had put out the word that they're going to Mecca now, and there won't be any plunder taken. This is already an announcement that this is not a military expedition. And then the Quran represents that the peace of God, the Sakina, came upon the hearts of the Muslims, and gave them the fortitude not to take revenge, not to fight. And it says that God withheld the hands of the believers and the hands of the pagans from the believers in the heart of Mecca, in Batn Mecca, which is the area around the Kaaba, the shrine to God. So those later sources, I think, have taken, I see this as kind of a peace procession. The believers had been exiled in Medina for a decade, and now they just walked right back into their homes. They came back into the city, and nobody dared accost them about it. And in the meantime, there's some indication that a lot of people in Mecca had secretly converted, so that there were people there that would welcome them. But even the pagans had given up, because the pagans were breaking their own rules. They weren't supposed to fight or exclude people from pilgrimage to the Kaaba, to the shrine to God. And they had been boycotting the Muslims and not letting them come from Medina on pilgrimage. So I think there's some indication in the Quran that people thought badly of them for breaking their own rules. So in the end, they acquiesced. The later sources, there were 10,000 Muslim warriors, and they had battle standards and swords, and they marched on Mecca, and the Meccans, didn't want to fight them, and so they gave up. But that's not what the Quran says. It looks to me like a peace march. It looks like, a collective action of a civil society group, which was almost kind of daring the Meccans to break the laws of sanctuary by using violence under these circumstances. And the Quran celebrates that they didn't do it, that God kept each other from fighting. One of the earlier historians who tells the story with a kind of little bit of a martial bent, he says that, he's Urwa ibn Zubair, he says that Al-Zubair ibn Awam, who was his father, was given a battle standard to march into Mecca by the Prophet. I'm a little bit suspicious of this story, because A, it's not in the Quran, and B, his father later revolted and tried to become caliph. And so by the time the story is being told, you might be trying to uphold his position by saying, well, he was the one, who conquered Mecca. It doesn't seem like Mecca was conquered. It seems like it acquiesced and that the whole thing was peaceful. And the Quran is, as I said, delighted that it was all very peaceful. The commentators on the Quran were very, very smart people. And they knew grammar much better than I do, and ever could hope to. They say Arabic is the tongue of the angels because you have to study it all your life, die, become an angel, and then you understand all the grammar. But they weren't trained historians, and so I think if you read the Quran through the lens of history, it looks very different. So that's my story to you, is that peace and peace activism is central to the Quran, that much of it looks much more like the Sermon on the Mount than it looks like a militant screed. And I see these Orientalists, the prophet was a militant prophet. I don't see him that way. I see him as a very reluctant warrior at a particular stage of life when he felt that he had to defend his community. But that the overall thrust of his teachings was always to get back to that pre-conflict status quo of peace. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Cole, for sharing your erudition with us this afternoon in a way which shines, I'm sure, new light on traditions that many of us thought were familiar to us, and that also deeply challenges reflexive associations of Islam and the Prophet Muhammad with violence. I think you've done a great public service in writing this book, and so thank you from all of us. Thank you so much. Now, we do have around 45 minutes for questions. I would ask anyone that does have a question to just make their way up to the microphone over there so that we can all hear you. And I'm sure there will be very many questions for Professor Cole, so I would also just ask that you exercise some restraint in phrasing your questions and keep them as succinct as possible so that everyone has a chance to speak. So anyone with questions, please make your way to the microphone. And maybe I'll start off with a question, moderator's prerogative. I was hoping you could talk a bit more about the way that Islam at its origins conceptualized the relationship between Muslims and Christians and Jews. A few years ago, we had Professor Fred Donner come speak about his book, Muhammad and the Believers at the Origins of Islam, where he argues that instead of seeing Muslim as a rigid social identity, Muhammad was actually starting a movement of believers, not specifically just of Muslims. And so I'm wondering if you can talk about the conception of Muslim identity that's emerged from your study. Thanks.
Well, Fred Donner is right, as usual, about his reading of the Quran's kind of sociology. The word Muslim or Islam in the Quran itself does not refer to the community of the Prophet in an exclusive way. I'm sorry to tell all of the Muslims this, that the right word for them is actually mu'min, according to the Quran, and that they have gotten mixed up and called themselves Muslim when that's a much more universal term in the Quran. In the Quran, the disciples of Jesus are quoted at one point, Nahnu Muslimun, we are Muslims. Even, there's a story in the Quran about Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, and he manages to convert her out of paganism. She says, now I have become a Muslim. Well, I mean, this story is being told for moral purposes, not for history, but this is 1,000 years before Christ, so it's 3,000 years ago. And she's from pagan Yemen, from Himyar. And she says she's a Muslim. So obviously, she's not saying she's a Muslim in the way that people now use the word. And I argue that it means monotheist. And it's actually very interesting that it means monotheist, because there wasn't a word for monotheist until Henry Moore, the Cambridge Neoplatonist of the 1600s, invented that term. That it didn't exist. And a lot of terms that we take for granted in theology nowadays are fairly new, actually. So, but I think that the Quran preceded Henry Moore by 1,000 years, and that it uses this word Muslim to refer to monotheism. And so Abraham and his son Ishmael and Solomon and the Queen of Sheba and even Pharaoh, that Pharaoh who persecuted Moses, as he's drowning, according to the Quran, then he says, I'm a Muslim. It doesn't mean the religion of Muhammad. What does really mean the religion of Muhammad was Alladina Amanu, those who believed, which interestingly, if you translate it into Greek, is exactly the phrase that Paul uses to describe the Christians, those who have believed. It's a community of faith and belief that's being talked about, and in the sense of believed in the Prophet's mission and in the Quran and so forth. And there's even a verse which Fred Donner drew attention to late in the Quran, where it remonstrates with the Bedouin who had adopted the Prophet's religion, and who says that we're mu'min, we're believers, and it says, no, sorry guys, you know, thanks for your support, but you're not quite there yet. Just say aslamna, just say we have submitted, we have accepted, but you're not quite to the belief stage yet. And you think about Bedouin, they were not literate people, and they hadn't memorized the Quran, and they hadn't been around the Prophet because they were out in the boondocks, and so they had heard that there's a great man there, and they're following him, and this is a very basic kind of commitment. And the Quran is just telling them, but what it tells you is that Islam is not as good as Iman, that submission is not as good as belief. There are levels of this according to the Quran. So, and there's another interesting thing, which is that within the Muslim community, there's this distinction between belief and submission, but the word that's used for submission or acceptance is also the broad general one for all of the monotheistic Abrahamic faiths. And so one of those verses that I showed you about the virtue of repelling evil with good and so forth actually is not about the followers of Muhammad, because it says the people who had a book before this one, presumably Christians, who were the immediate predecessors of the Muslims, do this. And so it's praising Christians for obeying the Sermon on the Mount. And then it says, and they believe that the Quran is true. And you don't know. They might have been Christian converts, or they might have joined the general monotheistic community that Muhammad was trying to build up around himself. So I very much agree with Donner that the early community is an ecumenical one. This also comes about, and I'll just make one last point, which is it also becomes clear in the document that's called the Constitution of Medina, or the Treaty of Medina, that the Prophet made with the people of the city when he moved there in 622, and which survives, and which even the most skeptical of historians think is an authentic document. It says that the Jews of the city and the Muslims constitute one nation. They're all part of the same ummah. So nowadays, most Muslims, when they say ummah, they're not including the Jews in that, but the Treaty of Medina does. And it says they have their religion and we have ours, very much like the diction of the Quran. So you could have a different religion and still be part of Muhammad's ummah, according to the Treaty of Medina. So these very early sources, of course, are depicting a time and a place which was wholly unlike the evolution of the later Muslim community in places like Baghdad and Damascus, where differentiating from Christian practice became important to people, and so gradually there may be some of these ecumenical emphases sometimes fell out.
Thank you. Dr. Hayani.
Thank you very much for a very, very fascinating, actually, lecture. And I just want to ask you, is your book being translated into Arabic, especially in Saudi Arabia? Because I really think it's very, very important for a book like this to be widely read, especially in the so-called heart of Islam, you know, where it's the exact opposite is happening. Okay. And I just, I read this as a question. The other thing is, have you been approached by, for example, Trump and company, just to give them a few lectures or a seminar or a workshop about, the kind of Islam they are fighting? They are fighting the wrong Islam.
We actually invited Donald Trump here today, but unfortunately he wasn't able to make it.
Now, I just want to make one, these are the questions, but I just want to, while you were talking, I remember something that we learned at school, that when the Prophet went into Mecca, as you said, it did not take arms, etc., etc. Then he stood up somewhere, and he asked the people, ماذا تظنون أني فاعل بكم? Which is literally, what do you think I'm going to do with you? And so the people respond saying, أخ كريم وابن أخ كريم, which means a generous brother who is the son of a generous uncle. And so he said to them, اذهبوا فأنتم الطلقاء. Go and you are free. And that's exactly the spirit that you are trying to, I think you project in your book. And, yeah. Okay, thank you very much. So I just want to ask you, has your book been translated into, well, especially Arabic and Turkish and all the other languages,
yes,
to understand that actually the main mission of Muhammad was not war and all that nonsense. And two, on the other side, here in the United States, and being, of course, the most powerful country in the world, and and of course, where Islamophobia is really a big industry, has this book or like your mission, for example, being being like followed or being understood by those who have these wrong ideas about Islam and Muslims?
Okay. Thank you. Well, my agent is in charge of translation rights, so if anybody hears of a translator in the Arab world, I'd be glad to give them the phone number. I haven't commissioned a translation. I haven't heard yet. There's been a nibble from one of the Gulf states, so I'm pretty sure it will get into Arabic eventually. And as you say, one of my books was translated in Turkish, so the publisher may be interested in this one. And I am hoping that it will be translated into those languages, but I also hope if there are translations, that people will do it into German and French and European languages like that. And apparently there's something really wrong with the Czechs. So it would be, they did this poll, Pew, that would you welcome a Muslim member into your family if your son or daughter got married to a Muslim? How would you feel about that? Scandinavians are great. Any of you who are interested in this poll can look it up, but the Swedes and the Dutch and so forth, like 87% of them say it would be fine to marry a Muslim. I'm not sure the numbers are so high among the Muslims, but in any case, but the Eastern Europeans are very low numbers, and the Czechs are 6% that they would want that. I don't know what's Czech. Why would they be like that? But in any case, I do hope that the book will be widely translated over time, but I don't know anything about that right now. With regard to the U.S. government, they have that countering violent extremism and so forth. And frankly, I won't want to get involved too much in all those things because they're very political, and I think they make invidious assumptions about the Muslim community to begin with. They don't. Our major problem in the United States at the moment is violent extremism on the far white nationalist right. Somehow our president seems to think they're very fine people, so they're not having a program of countering violent extremism where it's most needed. But I do imagine that people who are interested in intercommunal dialogue or government officials who are interested in Islam will read my book, and I'm hoping it'll maybe change some minds.
Samir.
So critics of the Quran often bring up the issue of slavery and how the Quran addresses slavery, particularly with women slaves. There's a verse in the Quran that talks about what the right hand possesses and your rights with women slaves, and also towards slavery in general. What are your thoughts about that, and why didn't the Quran again, I'm speaking from the critic's perspective. The Quran has made several things haram or forbidden. Why didn't it just come out and say that if it didn't support slavery, why didn't it just come out and say slavery is haram? Just curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Right. Well, I'm a historian and not a theologian, so all I can tell you is that slavery was being practiced in that era, and that all of the religious scriptures that grew up in the era of slavery allow it. So, for instance, there's a letter in the New Testament strictly instructing a good Christian, if a slave runs away and comes to your house, you have to return the slave to its property owner. So that was Christian scripture of the time. And of course, slavery is recognized, and also concubinage in the Hebrew Bible. So Sarah is said to have given Hagar to Abraham, so she shared her slave with him so that he could have a child by her. And there's no mention about Hagar being involved in this decision making. The critics of the Quran in this regard are being invidious if they think it's anything distinctive, because it's not. But the other thing to say about the Quran is that in the Quran, it says that the rich people in Mecca don't know how to ascend the steep path of ethics. And what is that steep path of ethics? Is caring for an orphan, feeding a grubby vagrant, somebody who's really smelly and dirty and is homeless, and taking them in and giving them food, and freeing a slave. So what the Quran is saying is that a really virtuous person doesn't have slaves. And a really virtuous person would manumit their slaves. And to the extent that the Prophet clearly hoped that his community would over time acquire high levels of ethics and virtue, I think the argument could be made that the Quran envisages abolition.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for the wonderful talk. My question is about this current society that we live in. All of the people who came to attend the talk are interested in monotheism, but most of the people that you interact with daily, I find, are atheists. And for whatever their backgrounds, I think, because of their backgrounds, they're very reluctant to religion in general. So what are your thoughts on that? And I would like to get a little bit of insight into where are they coming from, what are they thinking, and how to deliver a message of love and understanding and peace to them, to make them see that being a believer is not really a bad thing. So yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer your question. I can tell you that the opinion polling suggests that people are leaving religion in fair numbers. And there had been holdouts. I have a degree undergraduate degree in history of religions, and I was always interested in sociology of religion. So I follow the journals, and there have been some places like Germany and the United States with very high levels of belief in God and of religious practice, according to the polling. Though I'm always suspicious that when the pollster calls them and says, how often do you go to church? And it's twice a year, in Easter and Christmas, and people say, every week, because they tell the pollsters what they think they ought to be doing rather than what they're doing. But even if you take that into account, in some places religious belief has been high, in other places not so much. So the French, in the 1970s, only 50% of them believed in God. And now I think it's much less. I think only 12% of Catholics ever go to church in France. I once was with a French person, and she sneezed, and I said, "God bless you," and she shouted at me. She said, "There is no God." I thought, well, gee, it's a figure of speech. I mean, so they seem to be like militant about it, but now more recently, because of the pedophilia crisis in the Catholic Church, where it's estimated, in some places 9% of the priests were pedophiles, that people have been leaving the church in droves. And so in Germany, faith has collapsed there among Catholics. And in Ireland, which was always very strong religious, and so forth. I haven't seen the numbers for Spain, but we seem to be in an era in which the foibles of organized and institutional religion are driving people away from it, and for understandable reasons. Who would want their kid around some guy? What I would say is that there is a lot of now positive psychology research, and the evidence appears to be that religious belief and belonging to community are good for you. If you think being happy is good for you. I mean, there may be goths who wouldn't approve, but they do seem to be involved in well-being and positive affect. And so maybe it's not a good thing that people are fleeing all of these religious organizations. And in the United States, the millennials now, about 30% of them, if you ask them what is their religion, it's none. And traditionally in the United States, the none group, N-O-N-E, were only about 9%. So it seems to me, however, that from what I can tell, I don't know more about this than any of you, some of the problem may be the religious people who are being extreme or doing things that cast religion into a bad light. And so I think there may need to be a major reformation if they're ever going to get people back. I think the Catholic Church clearly has a big problem, which it is not sufficiently dealing with. I don't mean that it hasn't tried to deal with it to some extent, but it's not enough. And then, in the Muslim community worldwide, I gave this similar talk at a mosque in Alabama, and a young man stood up and was talking about all of the Islamophobia spread around by these organizations. They spent $40 million on it and so forth. And there was an elderly Indian Muslim man in the background who said, yes, but we have some young people in our community who are also not helping. Yeah. Next. Or is that all right? Yeah.
Patrick?
So, we're talking about peace. And I could say that you have peace and then you have war. So you could describe war as being interrupted peace. So most of history is like peace, and it's interrupted, and then we have wars. So I'd like to bring to your attention a moment of interrupted peace, which occurred within a decade or so of this new faith being founded, these new believers in the message of Muhammad. And you had like a war broke out among them as to what the message was. There was the new followers had been taking notes, and they contradicted. And this led to a kind of a war. So the Caliph, the leader, who was then the leader after Muhammad, he called together a council to sort out the revelation that was received by Muhammad. And how he done it was, what Muhammad got from the angel Gabriel was written down by a secretary, and now this book was in the possession of one of the wives of Muhammad. So he asked he requested to have that book brought to him, and with 3 companions of the Prophet Muhammad, they had a council and they came up with the Quran. And then the instruction was given out, and then you have notes or anything written down, destroy them. Because it's just, all we had was fighting and disputes and all that. So that was done. And even the original writing down of the revelations were given back to the wife, one of the wives of Muhammad.
Sorry, Patrick, could you come to your question, because we do have several more people who would also like to ask.
I'll speed forward. And so everything, the notes were all destroyed, and even what was given back to the wife, it was burnt, which was very strange to me. I said, how did this come about? That should have been the very book that should have been the Quran. And yet it is not. What we have today includes 3 companions, what their input was. And then, of course, then you had an interruption of peace shortly after that between Ali and another competitor as to who the leader of this Muslim world is. Anyway, so that brings me to, I think I read that you were at one time at the university in Cairo, Al-Azhar University?
I was at the American University in Cairo.
Yeah, there's a famous university there.
Yeah,
1,000 years.
Yes, sure.
And it was founded by the Shiite branch, even though it's a Sunni country, the country of the Sunni branch. And okay, to bring it right up to the point, I read that Ali was also writing down the revelations that were given to Muhammad. And that manuscript was kept in Najaf in Iraq. But around the year 1000 or shortly thereafter, it was sent to Cairo from Najaf, because in Cairo you had a Shiite center, a university. And that it may be there, that manuscript was kept there. And what happened to it after that? Did it get lost in
okay, let me try to address your general question here. I see you have basically 2 emphases in what you've brought up. One is the history of war after the Prophet's preaching, including civil war, what the later Muslim tradition called fitna, and the other is about the history of the Quran itself. With regard to the later period, I don't deal with that in my book for the most part, and so I'm off the hook. I'm not alleging that because the scripture of Islam mandates forms of peace, both negative peace and positive peace, that Muslims have always lived up to those ideals. And indeed, it seems to me that none of the religions have lived up to the ideals in their scriptures, and certainly the Christians through history have not behaved as you would imagine if you just read the Sermon on the Mount and say you were an alien from another civilization and you knew the Sermon on the Mount and then you went to study the history of Christians, you would be confused. Were they taking it like they were Gnostics and they were doing the opposite of what they were instructed, or what? And even in the time of the Prophet himself, the Christian community was deeply divided in the Near East between the Chalcedonians and the Miaphysites, and there was a lot of breaking of heads and persecution. And there's some thinking that one of the reasons for which people seem to have not minded so much the advent of Muslim rule after the time of the Prophet in the 630s and 40s in places like Syria and Egypt was that at least they weren't being bothered by the darn Chalcedonians anymore, and the Muslim rulers really didn't care very much about their theology or how they did their rituals and so forth. So the Quran is not naive. It's born into a world of these kinds of struggles, and the Quran in the Medina period very strictly instructs the believers not to fall into having sectarian differences in the way that the previous religions did. I'm quite sure that's a reference to the Miaphysites and the Chalcedonians. And then, as you say, by the 650s, there was this big civil war between the partisans of Ali and Muawiyah. And the other thing to say, though, is that what exactly happened after the Prophet's death in 632, and contemporary historians are not so sure, because all we have are these stories told in Baghdad 150 and 200 and 300 years later. They could be folk tales for all we know. And some of those stories that are told about, say, the caliphs or about the Umayyads, clearly, have biblical references to them. This is a kind of literature. And so you just don't know, is this a kind of fiction? And so nowadays, people are looking to the archaeology. They're looking to Syriac writings, which we have early manuscripts for, which can be dated. And a lot of the kind of the Abbasid story about early Islam, which has become the standard one, is being questioned. And the questioning would even go to the point of some of these histories. With regard to your other question about the Quran, just very briefly let me say that, again, the stories about what happened with the collection of the Quran don't appear to be true for the most part. And the Quran itself contradicts some of them. So, for instance, some later sources say the Quran was kept orally during the Prophet's life. It only got written down after he died. Others say that there was Katib al-Wahy, that there were secretaries who took it down and so forth. The Quran itself has a passage. Now we have found these inscriptions in Yemen in the Sabaic language, which is very close to Arabic. The inscriptions are voluminous, and they've been deciphered, and people are now reading them, and they come right up to the time of the Prophet. And we've discovered that those Sabaic inscriptions were called Zabur. That was the technical term for Sabaic writing. And there's a passage in the Quran that says, when you write the Quran in Zabur, for the scholars of the children of Israel, for the Jewish rabbis, they recognize its validity. They recognize this is a monotheistic document like what they believe in, which tells you that the Quran was written out in the time of the Prophet himself in some of these pre-Islamic scripts. So in Yemen, in the great mosque there, which is very old, goes back to the time of Ali, they have found some very, very old Qurans. And they have an institute in Sana'a, God help them, not to be bombed, but they have an institute in Sana'a where they brought in a German team to reassemble these old Qurans that they found in a room in the old mosque in 1972. I went there and visited, and Ursula Dreibholz, one of the German scholars who was in charge of this project, told me that she was convinced some of these Qurans that they had found were very early, maybe early Umayyad, that is the middle of the 600s. And after I visited in 1994, they found one which was a palimpsest. A palimpsest is a manuscript that has been written over by another manuscript. So in the old days, parchment was expensive, and you just take a blacker ink and write over it. And now we have imaging capabilities that they can see what's underneath. There was another Quran underneath. And it's not in the order of the Caliph Uthman of 652. It's a different ordering of the surahs. So it's very likely pre-Uthmanic. And then a scholar, Behnam Sadiqi at Stanford, was given permission to take a little tiny corner of it and send it for carbon dating. Came back 75% chance of being 645 or earlier, which would be Omar period. So we may have some manuscripts in various repositories now that, so carbon dating, by the way, is not very good, and it gives you a range of 100 years, but some of these seem to be very early. And some of them don't seem to accord with those later stories which were told about how the Quran was disseminated. There seems to be now increasingly a manuscript history of the Quran. And we have a number of Qurans which we think are early Umayyad, some of them in the Paris Bibliothèque Nationale. So this field is changing very rapidly. There's a whole cohort of younger scholars who are getting involved in this. Asma Halali has just brought out a book on the Sana palimpsest. And I think we just have to, at the moment, I would just hold my breath and not be very convinced about any of these stories. But interestingly, the one that we now think is maybe the earliest exemplar of the Quran is not very different from the standard Quran that we all use, which is the Cairo 1932 edition. There are a few things, like sometimes it says dhalika, that, and it has kadhalika, thus. You know, that thus. It's not, there are a few minor things, but there's not any big difference. I think we just should wait now till much more research is done before we conclude about these things.
Thank you.
Could everyone who has a question please make their way to the mic just so we can see how many that we have, and we'll take the next question, please.
Thank you very much for your talk, and to the organizers for arranging this. This is lovely. My name is Neil. Just a quick question. It really follows from when you said that this is the first book on this topic of peace in Islam and in the Quran. And I'm just thinking about, like, I'm struck by the idea of how, you know, the piece is very cosmopolitan and pluralistic and practical. And I'm thinking about how much longer it took European thought to arrive at that idea. I mean, I forget exactly, but I'm assuming in the 17th century or whatever, before the idea of like international relations and so on takes root. And I'm just wondering if you have a few thoughts on that huge 1,000-year gap. Is it like how these ideas were, or let's say European thinkers were insulating themselves from these ideas, or I'm not sure. So any thoughts on that? I'm curious. Sure.
Well, as I take your question, you're interested in the Quran's cosmopolitanism and ecumenism, and it certainly was unique. In my view, for its time and for a long time thereafter, in the sense that imagining a community of people of various faiths who were united by some principle, and admittedly the pagans were excluded, but then there weren't that many pagans anymore, and after a while there weren't any at all. It was an idea about a unity of monotheists, of Jews and Christians and what became known as Muslims. And I argue that actually there's some reason to think, both in the Quran and some of the later sources, that the Quran recognizes the Zoroastrians as well, which I think is actually makes sense, because there's kind of monotheism, and they had a prophet, and they had scripture, and they believed in the resurrection, and so forth. Two things to say. One is, this notion was completely foreign to Roman Christianity as it grew up after Constantine, which became more and more intolerant, and so no place was made for another group, and Jews were kind of more suffered than anything else, and strict laws were made against Jews. Like it was a death penalty for a Jew to marry a Christian, and they were penalized economically and so forth. And then it got to the point in European history where in 1492, the Spanish Reconquista actually forbade the practice of any religion but Roman Catholicism in Spain, and expelled over time all the Jews and Muslims who would not convert, many of whom then went to Istanbul or Algeria or probably to the New World. I think a lot of Latinos are descended from Muslims and Jews who you could get on a ship at Seville and get away from the Inquisition, and not that it didn't exist in Mexico, but it wasn't very powerful. So there are entire centuries in some countries, including Britain, when there were no Jews. There weren't allowed to be any Jews. And at the same time, in the Muslim world, Judaism and Christianity were recognized religious faiths. And it's not that it was paradise or that they were, equal or that there weren't occasional pogroms. But on the whole and by and large, if you're comparing Europe and the Middle East, it's night and day on this issue. And by the way, the later Muslim tradition developed this theory of poll tax on the non-Muslims. Actually, I think it's based on a misinterpretation of a Quran verse, because the verse that they refer to says that they read it as saying, those who were given a book and don't believe in God in the last day have to pay recompense, jizya. The Quran always says about Jews and Christians that they believe in God in the last day. That verse cannot be about them. And who was paying jizya, I think, were the pagan tribes who had broken their treaties with the Prophet and attacked him. And it's not clear. Given a book can mean given scripture, or it can mean given a treaty. And the Constitution of Medina, it begins by saying this is a kitab, this is a book between Prophet Muhammad and the people of Medina. So some of later Muslim practice which made non-Muslims unequal, although they still were given societal protection, it seems to me is not mandated by the Quran. And the Quran envisages really a kind of community of equals among the monotheists, and it allows Christians and Jews and Muslims to intermarry, which is the definition of the creation of an ethnicity. So I think the Quran was aiming at an Abrahamic ethnicity. And so it's really only in the Enlightenment in the 17th century that you begin to get emancipation of Jews from special taxes, and the French Revolution did away with some of those things, and the American Revolution and the First Amendment. In a way, I think you're right that some of those ideals that we see only as a result of the European Enlightenment were preceded in very interesting ways by the Quran in the 7th century.
Thank you so much for being here with us today and coming so far in the snow. My partner is the one reading your book, so forgive me if my question is ignorant and you've maybe answered it already in your book, I'm not sure. But you touched briefly at the very beginning about the limited sort of historical references to pacifist Muslims with the Tariqa in Senegal and so forth. And what you've shared with us today, and I'm gathering from your book, you've painted such a beautiful picture of the context of that time and of the Quran and the Prophet's, path of peace and mission of peace. But as the professor mentioned earlier in his question, many Muslims in our time need to understand that. And I'm wondering if you've given any direction in your book as to how we create this Reformation 1400 years later to have Muslims of now understand the context of peace. For example, when you talk about good peace and bad peace, the self-defense, there's a big difference between standing on a battlefield for an afternoon in hand-to-hand or sword-to-sword combat to face a potential aggressor. But in our times of modern-day warfare, where it's send a missile and blow up a village, so we send a missile and blow up a village, to contextualize this for now, and I know you probably haven't drawn from hadith in your book, you focused on the Quran, but in different hadith which reference the confines of what it means self-defense and not harming buildings or other people, that to me that renders modern day warfare haram. And how do we take this to the next phase of looking at this, what you've presented and shared to us so beautifully, so that we can reassess how we murder each other now and stop it based upon a prophetic example.
Well, I think you've said it all. More power to you. I think you're certainly right that that the whole, not just the Quran, but the whole Muslim juridical tradition forbids the wanton killing of innocents in war. There's been disputes among the jurists about whether aggressive war or only defensive war is allowed. You can tell what I think the Quran implies, but there's no dispute, as far as I'm aware, that innocents may not be killed in war. And even the great jurists of the medieval period forbid sneak attacks. So if a drone falls on somebody who's not expecting it, that would be forbidden by them and by the whole tradition. And I think implicit in the Quran is a sense in which, just as Mecca was a zone of peace by the sacred traditions, not only of Islam, but even before Islam, I think what the Prophet really seems to have been aiming at, and what's implicit in the Quran, is that zone of peace in Mecca would gradually expand everywhere. And so, you know, the great historian Tabari tells a very interesting story, and I can't prove it's right or it's wrong, but those Iranian officers who conquered Yemen around 570, and then had children, and in the time of the Prophet was preaching, it was their sons who had married local women who were kind of in charge of Yemen, and they were viceroys of the Iranian Sassanid emperor. Tabari says that at some point, 628, 629, they just embraced the religion of the Prophet. And so, according to this history, Yemen, Najran, all of those areas south of the Hijaz acquiesced in Muhammad's leadership religiously and to some extent politically, voluntarily. There was no war. And then if I'm right that the procession to Mecca was peaceful, you know, it's not clear that the Prophet ever conquered anything. That the message went out quite peacefully, defended, but conquering is not in the picture. So I think that that's the vision underlying it all, and I think, as you say, a lot of the forms of contemporary warfare would be forbidden in Islamic law, and I think also in American constitutional law. So I think this idea of the CIA dropping a drone on someone who's never been charged or tried, including Americans occasionally. And I'm not saying they're good people or they've done good things, but I'm just saying you don't worry about it. I mean, the state's not allowed to injure people without a rule of law. I think that this is something that governmental practice has gotten ahead of our ethicists, and we as a society need to start addressing these practices, and they're very troubling, as you say.
So can I also ask us, because we know that there were also restrictions placed on environmental destruction in warfare, which I think also challenges this very human-centric notion we have of peace. You know, we also see it in the idea that Mecca was a sanctuary for non-human animals as well as humans. So maybe could you just comment quickly on that, on expanding from anthropocentric notions of peace?
I have to give that more thought. You've had this is a book, Aziz. I encourage you to write it. But yes, I mean that whole notion of the hema. I think more could be done with that. And by the way, it's not just in the Quran, but it shows up in Hadith, in the Bukhari, and so forth. The rules for it, yeah. Then the question becomes: is it something special to a particular place, or should it be universalized? And that would be a very interesting study. I haven't done it. I'm sorry.
Okay. Robert.
Thank you. So I want to bring you back to today, or forward to today, because I'm interested in sort of the extreme demonization by the West of Islam, and I would like to ask you your opinion on this. And somehow I think that Islam, in its essence and its principle, stands as a bulwark against the West. And because of that, it has to be attacked and ultimately almost destroyed. And that's kind of what we're seeing. And I mean, how much do you agree with that as a principle, that it is, in its theory, in its principle, in its essence, it really stands against kind of the capitalist ethos, and therefore cannot be left on its, to be that?
Well, I think you've put your finger on something, but I'd like to switch it around a little bit. First of all, I don't think it's useful to make a dichotomy, maybe you didn't mean to, between the West and Islam. My argument is that Islam is a world religion, but it all along has been a Western religion. It's most Europeans only adopted Christianity around the time of the rise of Islam, when it went into Spain. There was a lot of paganism still in Europe. So Islam is not very far from being contemporaneous with Christianity as a European religion. This is something I know people would shout at me if I said this in Europe, but I think it's clearly true. And then what Europe is also should be interrogated, because the Roman Empire included what is now the Middle East. And St. Augustine wrote The City of God in Tunisia. And so this dichotomy is coming out of later European nationalism and a later imaginative geography which doesn't actually fit the world as it existed in early Islamic times. And about the place of Muslims in the imaginary of the military-industrial complex, which is, I think, how I would characterize it rather than capitalism per se, because I want to tell you I've lived in a lot of Muslim countries that shocked me by their capitalism, but I was young and naive, and I had been in the 60s, so I had this image of India as spiritual, and those people are into gold. In a big way. They put gold leaf on their food. Anyway, my point being that I was just being naive to imagine that the Indians weren't human beings like everybody else. But I don't think it's a matter of capitalism. I think it's a matter of the military-industrial complex, which has become, in some ways, displaced the government in a lot of countries, and not just in European heritage ones. And the military-industrial complex is grasping. How do you convince the general public in a democracy to let it run, to give up their rights, to give it $715 billion a year when there's no major war going on? How do you do that? Is that you need an enemy. You need to make them afraid. And then, first you make them afraid, and then you say, well, I've got a solution for you. I'm here to protect you from X. And I think, in the middle 20th century, it was the communists that played that role. So Dick Nixon got his start running against the Wobblies, the labor union in San Francisco, who he incorrectly identified as communists to the suburbanites who were voting for him, and threatened them with being taken over by Stalin because they had a labor union in their neighborhood. And it worked. And so people used the Red Scare as a way of getting people to vote for things that they might not otherwise vote for. And not only Nixon, but many politicians made their way in my lifetime in that way. And I think, the collapse of the Soviet Union was a severe challenge to the military-industrial complex, because now there's no big military force that's opposing the United States. And it turns out that, the 5 million Soviet army were mostly ditch diggers and had outhouses, and they weren't actually so threatening. And we only ever had, at most, 100,000 communists in the United States, and then after Khrushchev revealed Stalin's crimes, it fell to 50,000. So they were able to do a lot with a little in that era, but then when it collapsed, they needed some other threat, imaginary threat, because a real threat is no good because then you have to do something about it practically. The imaginary threat is wonderful for the military-industrial complex because you can go on fighting it forever. And you can see this now is that they went into Syria and now they have to, people are upset with Trump that he wants to get out of Syria. Why? Well, because ISIL hasn't been defeated. Well, I don't know, the caliphate has been defeated. Oh no, but there's still ISIL. The ideology hasn't been defeated. Well, when would you expect to defeat it? Like, when would the Taliban be defeated in Afghanistan? So it's wonderful because it goes on forever. And then you can reconfigure your allies as enemies. So they actually, you know, they have made the Middle East kind of threatening. The people in North America have this idea of the threatening Middle East. The United States has a legal category of a non-NATO ally. Who are the non-NATO allies? They're given special access to Pentagon equipment, and they do joint military exercises with the U.S. military. Morocco, Bahrain, Pakistan. Shall I go on? They're Muslim countries. 14 non-NATO allies, 12 of them are Muslim countries. They include Israel. And then Turkey is in NATO. So this imaginary enemy of the Muslims not only doesn't exist, but they're actually our allies. But they can be trotted out to make people afraid so that Trump can say Islam hates us and we need $715 billion annually for our Pentagon budget. We spend more on our military in the United States than the next 14 countries combined. So China is in there. The UK, which is not an insignificant military, is in there. And there's no reason for it, except that they find ways to make people afraid and do this. So I think that's the positioning of the Muslims is, I'm sorry to tell the Muslims in the audience that they have succeeded the communists as the unicorn, as the imaginary threat. And of course it damages real people's lives, it's damage to society, but I think it's very cynical and it's very systematic. And if you look at that Islamophobic network that was giving money to defame Muslims and make people afraid of them, it's very interesting to me. Who is on that list? John Malin Scaife. And any of you ever heard of him? No. He's just a random billionaire. I don't think that he has anything to do with Islam or knows what it is. Why is he giving money to defame Muslims? Because the military-industrial complex class in the United States needs that enemy.
I think unicorn is one of the nicer things that Muslims have been called in the context of the war on terror, so thank you for that. We'll take...
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you very much for that. But I was thinking of not so much the material basis, but I also think that there's a spiritual basis. We don't have to get into that, but I do believe that there is a spiritual basis as well. Thank you.
I thought we did have some more questions after Robert. Yes, there's someone there that I can't see? No. Oh, okay, please come to the mic, and this will be our last question.
Hi. It's interesting you brought up this idea of Islam and Christianity rising at the same time. I saw some documentation about Christian monarchs in the medieval era that would wear calligraphy, Arabic Quranic calligraphy, and there was even a crescent moon on a lot of the churches. And I think the one in Vienna was taken down only 100 years ago. I was wondering if you knew anything about that.
No, I'm sorry, I don't know the specifics of, that's, not my field, but what I would say is this, that there were, the Ottoman Empire, for instance, which took Constantinople in 1453, emerged as a major European power, and it not only held the Balkans, but much of what we now think of as Eastern Europe, and I think it's now hard to imagine, but because later on it became weak and was ultimately defeated. But there was a moment, say in the 1500s, where the Ottoman Empire was really cool. And I think there was some imitation of it in Western Europe for that reason. And so there were some fads that the Ottomans went into that spread then to Europe and so forth. And but I think it's the same thing now that, you know, you always want to be like the cool kid. And the Ottomans were cool at one point. Frightening, but cool.
Right. Well, thank you very much. It was fascinating. Thank you.
So with that, we'll close the formal portion of the event, but Dr. Cole will be available to sign copies of his new book, which are for purchase here, right there at the table on the back. So this talk was just to whet your appetite for the immense riches that are contained in this book. So we hope you'll stick around for a bit, take a look at the book, and you can talk more with Professor Cole then. All that remains for me to do is to ask you to join me again in thanking Professor Cole for giving us so much rich food for thought, for not only challenging deeply intense stereotypes about the Islamic tradition, but also for reinvigorating our efforts in the present to work towards a negative as well as positive peace. So thank you very much, Professor Cole.